It happens. That's life. Aretha once said her father was never a narrow-minded man, and she didn't see herself that way either. She talked about doing little mini-tours now, not long ones, not the endless runs she'd known as a girl. Behind that casual remark was a lifetime of motion planes, buses, churches, theaters, and a childhood spent on stages she never chose. Aretha Franklin, the Queen of Soul, carried a voice that sounded like it could rattle the gates of heaven itself. The world saw power, poise, and unshakable faith. They heard the high notes and the hallelujahs. What they didn't see was the anger that burned beneath the gowns and church hats. According to those who knew her, behind every hymn about respect lay a wound that never quite closed. Men adored her, leaned on her, profited from her, and tried to claim pieces of her spirit. She forgave many of them, at least on the surface. But one man crossed a line so deep she cut his name out of her public life forever. Even at the height of her fame, when the spotlight seemed to swallow the stage, his shadow waited at the edge of every song. This is not a story about celebrity or ego. It is the secret she carried in silence, the man she was believed to truly hate more than anyone. First, you have to understand where her story began, the gospel roots and the men who tried to rule them. Before charts, awards, and presidential invitations, there was the church, New Bethel Baptist Church in Detroit, Michigan. It was there, inside a red brick sanctuary with worn wooden pews, that a young Aretha Franklin learned a human voice could move both heaven and earth. It was the late 1940 seconds. Sunday mornings felt like controlled thunder. The church filled with believers dressed in their best, the air heavy with talcum powder, cheap cologne, sweat, and shouted praise. The organ hummed low like a warning. At the pulpit stood her father, Reverend C.L. Franklin, tall and commanding, a preacher whose presence could quiet a room before he said a word. Across America, people knew him as the man who could make sinners cry just by raising his voice. They called him the $1,000,000 voice. His sermons were recorded on vinyl, shipped across state lines, and blasted from storefront speakers in Detroit, Chicago, and Memphis. A preacher that powerful should have been only a shepherd, but behind that golden tone there was another kind of authority, one that did not always feel like love. C.L. Franklin was not just a pastor. He was a brand, a businessman, a touring attraction in an era before artists had official managers. He understood that charisma could be monetized, and he ran his church accordingly. He ruled New Bethel like an empire and ran his home like a recording studio. Schedules, rehearsals, appearances, everything had purpose, everything had profit. At the center of that orbit was his little girl, Aretha. By 1953, when she was only 11 years old, he started taking her on the road as part of what the press later called the Gospel Caravan, a rolling revival that snaked through cities and small towns across the South. Crowds stood up from the pews when the child stepped to the microphone, singing "Precious Lord," with a voice that sounded far older than her small frame. People shouted, fainted, wept, but when the Hammond organ fell silent and the folding chairs were stacked, she was still just a teenager under her father's command, expected to obey, to perform on cue, and to keep her questions to herself. Writers like Craig Werner and David Ritz would later describe Reverend Franklin as a man of God with what some called a devil's appetite. On Sunday mornings, he thundered about purity, redemption, and holy living. When darkness fell, the house in Detroit changed. According to visitors, the rooms came alive with late-night laughter, cigarette smoke, clinking glasses, and the kind of music that didn't always sound like church. Politicians, singers, and preachers sank into his living room chairs. Deals were whispered over records and whiskey. Aretha saw everything. She saw his brilliance, his generosity, and the cracks in his halo. The same hands that baptized souls in the sanctuary were also seen pouring drinks for gospel stars in the den. She loved her father fiercely, but she feared him too. Those close to her said she was afraid of his temper and the way his approval could disappear without warning. By 1956, her voice had already become legend in church circles. She recorded her first gospel album, Songs of Faith, inside the same church where she had once swung her legs from the front pew as a little girl. Yet every contract, every offering, every dollar attached to her name passed through C.L. Franklin first. He signed the papers, chose the songs, and famously told Columbia Records, "You don't just get Aretha, you get me." Even when she stood under bright stage lights, surrounded by applause and organ chords, his presence was there, hovering just off stage, watching, correcting, deciding. Aretha would later say that her father gave her both the blessing and the burden of her gift. He showed her that faith could be a form of power, but that power could tighten into a cage. The lessons she learned inside New Bethel never really left her. In her world, love was rarely soft. It arrived wrapped in control, tied to duty, sanctified by Scripture, and enforced by fear. Long before any romantic relationship ever fractured her heart, her father had already revealed how authority could wear the face of devotion. That was the beginning of her legend, and the first wound she would never fully heal. It began like the kind of love story that only seems possible in the feverish glow of 1961 Detroit. Aretha Franklin was 19, quiet in public, radiant on stage, already whispered about in gospel circles as a prodigy whose voice could soften even the hardest faces in the room. Ted White was 29, sharply tailored, confident to the point of arrogance, the kind of man who entered a doorway as if the walls had been built for him. People around her pulled her aside and warned her. They said he was slick, dangerous, a man whose charm hid sharper edges. But Aretha, straining against years of her father's control, looked at Ted and saw something else. An exit. A promise of adulthood on her own terms. Or so she believed. Within months, Ted was no longer just a handsome presence at the edge of the stage. He became her husband and her manager. He handled her bookings, signed the paperwork, and decided which rooms she would stand in, which songs she would sing, what image she would present, and even who was allowed close enough to speak to her. On the surface, he appeared to be the strategist behind a rising star, the man steering her career out of the church and into the mainstream. In reality, as musicians later recalled, he was slowly tightening his grip around her life. People who worked with them at Columbia Records described Ted White as jealous, controlling, and quick to anger. Bassist Joe Tex was said to have watched him stare across a studio whenever Aretha laughed with another man. He didn't like anyone touching what he thought was his property, Tex reportedly said. At first, the bruises were hidden beneath long sleeves, big sunglasses, and carefully composed smiles. Studio engineers remembered long, strained silences, sudden explosions of shouting behind closed doors, and Aretha's eyes bright on stage, but in rehearsal filled with a flickering mix of defiance and dread. In the biography, Respect, by David Ritz, one of her close friends recalled, she would come in with her hair perfect, her nails flawless, but her spirit was gone. Ted's temper, according to those who witnessed it, could ignite without warning. A missed cue, a rehearsal that started late, a conversation he hadn't approved any of it could be enough. He followed her to interviews, sat just out of frame during photo shoots, and insisted on the final word over every session and every note. To the world, she was already the queen of soul. Inside her own marriage, she lived like a prisoner walking on glass. The breaking point came in the summer of 1968. The civil rights movement was surging through the South, and Aretha had just finished performing in Montgomery, Alabama, at an event where gospel choirs raised money for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s foundation. 2 weeks later, on the 15th of August 1968, she arrived in Augusta, Georgia, to headline a charity concert at the Civic Center. That night, the crowd crackled with anticipation. Aretha opened with "Chain of Fools," her voice roaring through the hall, rattling the rafters. Out front, the audience was electric. Backstage, another kind of storm gathered. Witnesses later said Ted White had been drinking heavily before the show. During the break, he accused her of flirting with a saxophonist. The argument spiraled fast. Voices rose, bounced off the concrete walls, and echoed down the corridor. Then, in front of members of her band and 2 stagehands, he hit her a single violent strike that froze the hallway. Someone shouted, "Get him off her!" Security rushed between them, but the damage had already settled into the room. Aretha did not return to the microphone that night. Out in the Civic Center, the audience waited, restless, for nearly 30 minutes before an announcer finally stepped to the stage and blamed technical issues for the cancellation. Back at the hotel, she moved through the room in near silence. Her makeup was smeared, her hands shaking as she folded dresses into her suitcase. The next morning, she boarded a flight back to Detroit, alone. She told no one her plans. According to David Ritz, it was in that dark Augusta hotel room, with the Georgia skyline glowing beyond the window, that she whispered 2 words to herself: never again. It was the promise that no man would ever own her life like that again. Their marriage stumbled on for a short time afterward. Ted apologized, pleaded, charmed, and threatened, cycling through the familiar pattern many survivors of abuse later describe. But something had broken in her that would not mend. By 1969, Aretha filed for divorce. When reporters asked her about it, she shut it down with a cool, simple phrase: "It just wasn't right." Behind closed doors, she told friends she had finally learned what love should never feel like. Decades later, when journalists tried to revisit the subject of Ted White, Aretha's entire body would stiffen. She would tighten her jaw, redirect the conversation, or shut it down completely. In one rare interview in the early 1990 seconds, when a reporter mentioned her first husband by name, she paused for a long stretch of silence and finally said, "He's someone I learned from, and that's all I'll say." That entire chapter of her life became a ghost unseen, unspoken, but always present behind the songs about freedom, pain, and reclamation. The woman who sang Think and Respect wasn't just performing empowerment, she was surviving it in real time. Ted White had taken pieces of her youth, her trust, and, for a while, nearly her voice. What he never managed to touch was her will. She rebuilt that in private, one decision at a time. And yet, as brutal as that story was, Ted was not the person she was said to truly hate. That man would enter the picture later. By the early 1970 seconds, soul music was no longer just a sound on the radio, it was an empire. At its center stood 2 rulers who refused to kneel to anyone: Aretha Franklin and James Brown. She reigned with gospel fire, he ruled with funk and controlled chaos. On stage, it looked as if they were part of the same rising force in Black America. Off stage, those close to the industry said they were locked in a quiet war that simmered beneath the spotlight for years. Their paths crossed in a way people still talk about. It was January 1968 at the Apollo Theater in Harlem, a night staged as a benefit in honor of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Aretha had just sent Chain of Fools out into the world, and James Brown was riding high off the success of I Got the Feelin'. The evening should have been a seamless celebration of black excellence, a united front of voices against a country in turmoil. Instead, it turned into a power struggle. According to crew members and musicians who were there, James Brown arrived hours behind schedule and immediately demanded to close the show. Organizers scrambled, reshuffling the lineup, repositioning artists who had been there since morning. Aretha, who had been rehearsing since dawn, watched from the wings as Brown's band unleashed a wall of sound that shook the building. The applause, witnesses said, was deafening. When it was finally her turn, the crowd was already exhausted, overstimulated, wrung out, restless in their seats. She walked to the mic anyway. Those who stood backstage remembered the way she lifted her chin, as if daring the room to forget who she was. She sang like someone carving her name into stone, every note sharp enough to cut through the noise left behind. That night, 2 legends shared the same stage, but only one walked off wearing a full smile. The unspoken tension followed them long after the curtain fell. By 1971, the rivalry had started to move beyond the stage and into the corridors of power. When President Richard Nixon invited Aretha Franklin to perform at the White House, people close to James Brown said he called his manager the very next day. Soon after, he secured his own appearance there. It was as if he wanted his name mentioned wherever hers appeared, like a shadow refusing to step back. Headlines began drawing lines between them, assigning titles that would stick. She was the Queen of Soul. He was the Godfather of Soul. Both demanded reverence. Neither had much interest in sharing a throne. The comparisons fed a quiet fire. Each new profile, each photograph, each review that praised one in the other's shadow added another layer of friction. The most infamous clash came on the 10th of March 1973 at the Soul Train Awards in Los Angeles. Backstage, the air was thick with hairspray, cigarette smoke, and the nervous shuffle of assistants juggling wardrobe racks and microphone cables. Aretha had just wrapped a televised duet with Ray Charles, a performance meant to be one of the evening's emotional peaks. Moments later, near a stairwell crowded with technicians and runners, a disturbance broke out. Witnesses later claimed that James Brown, visibly intoxicated, confronted her in front of crew members. He criticized her act, accusing her of turning soul music into what he reportedly called church theater. The words did not land as advice, they landed as an attack. Voices rose. A sound technician stepped between them. Security moved in before the exchange could spill into the main floor, where cameras and reporters were waiting. By morning, the story had already leaked. Variety ran a short column hinting at a heated confrontation between two soul titans. No names were printed, but inside the industry, everyone was said to know exactly who had been involved. From that point on, their relationship shifted from cool distance to absolute avoidance. When the two were later booked for the same televised gala in Chicago in 1975, Aretha's team laid down strict conditions. Separate entrances, separate dressing rooms, no shared press moments. The producers agreed. Those around James Brown claimed he used the arrangement as proof that he was still feared. Aretha's camp treated it as a necessary layer of protection. Their feud became an unspoken legend, a rumor that never quite faded, a storm cloud hovering over every award show, tribute concert, and industry gala, where both names appeared on the same program for the next 3 decades. In May 1988, when James Brown was arrested after a high-speed chase in Georgia, reporters quickly turned to other artists for comment. Aretha refused to say anything public, but friends later said she confided that she was not surprised. She believed he had become the living example of what soul music had always warned about, the destruction that comes when talent walks too far away from humility. Yet, when news broke of his death on the 25th of December 2006, she did not celebrate. That day, according to people in her inner circle, she stayed inside her Detroit home, quiet and withdrawn. She sent lilies to the funeral, but did not attend. The card carried no name, no signature, only the words, "Peace at last." Some reporters called her absence disrespectful. Insiders, however, claimed it was the only kind of closure she could bring herself to offer. That chapter of her life ended without apology, without reconciliation, without a staged handshake for the cameras. Two voices that had once lifted a generation had become, in many ways, mirror images of ambition and ego, each sacred to their fans, each carrying their own curse. When James Brown's name came up in later years, Aretha could speak about respect, influence, and history. But those who knew her best said she kept the deeper truth buried, wrapped in silence. Respect for her became an armor she wore in public. Silence was the sharper weapon, the way she chose to settle a war that never truly ended. By the dawn of the 1980 seconds, the throne of soul had begun to tremble. The sound that once ruled jukeboxes and concert halls now echoed in half-empty arenas, and the woman who had defined it, Aretha Franklin, found herself standing at the edge of a musical landscape that was rapidly changing. Disco had burned out, pop was rising, and labels wanted something new, something slicker, something younger. Columbia Records, the company that had once gambled on her crossover, wanted reinvention. They brought in Luther Vandross, a singer, songwriter, and producer whose reputation for precision was already legendary in studio circles. He was 30, stylish, and unshakably sure of his ear. People described his process as perfectionism that bordered on obsession. He believed he could modernize Aretha's sound and, in doing so, pull her back to the top of the charts. Their first session together began on the 2nd of December 1981 at Power Station Studios in Manhattan. On paper, it was a dream pairing, the Queen of Soul and a rising architect of contemporary R&B. The plan was simple: revive her career, polish her sound, and reintroduce her to a generation that knew drum machines and synthesizers better than church choirs and Hammond organs. In reality, the moment they stepped into the same creative space, the fuse was lit. From the very beginning, the tension was almost tactile. Luther brought in electronic drums, tight arrangements, and carefully layered background vocals, all timed and tuned with surgical precision. Aretha's instinct was the opposite. She trusted live horns, breathing rhythms, and the kind of improvisation that could flip a song inside out in the middle of a take. Assistants later said that some nights at Power Station, the air in the control room felt heavier than the cigarette smoke hanging over the mixing board. Neither of them liked to yield. Neither liked being told no. On the 22nd of January 1982, during the recording of Jump to It, things reached a breaking point. According to studio staff, Luther suddenly stopped the playback, turned from the console, and announced that an entire verse needed to be redone. The request wasn't presented as a suggestion, it was an order. Aretha stepped out of the vocal booth without a word and disappeared from the studio for hours. When she finally returned, she went back into the booth and delivered the verse again, this time with a new sharpness in her tone, a cool precision that sounded less like collaboration and more like a challenge. That take, cut with ice instead of warmth, ended up on the final record. Jump to It became a #1 hit, a commercial and radio triumph that seemed to prove the partnership was working. But behind the chart position, the relationship was already damaged. To Columbia's executives, the math was simple. Sales were up, radio was calling, and critics were writing about a comeback. To Aretha, something else was happening. Luther had begun, in interviews and profiles, to be described as the man who had saved her sound. In August 1983, Jet magazine ran a feature that framed him as the architect of her revival. Aretha, alone in a Los Angeles hotel suite when she read it, was said to have torn the magazine in half. Behind her calm stage presence, there was quiet humiliation. She felt as if she had been reduced from creator to product, from queen to project. Her legacy, built on nights in church basements and decades of grinding on the road, was being repackaged as the invention of a younger producer. The months that followed turned the studio into a battleground. During work on her next record, Get It Right, the fights intensified. On the 10th of November 1983, at Sigma Sound in Philadelphia, witnesses recalled shouting so loud during rehearsal that staff down the hall stopped what they were doing to listen. By midnight, Aretha's team had packed up and left the building. Luther stayed behind, finishing vocal overdubs alone, his name still tied to hers by contracts, even as their partnership was coming apart in practice. When the album was released the following year, their names appeared side by side on credits, but there was no real alliance left. She refused to do joint interviews. He stopped reaching out. The music connected them on paper, but the trust that made true collaboration possible had evaporated. What began as creative friction had become a wound that cut into the core of who she was, her pride, her artistry, and her authority. Time did not soften it. When Luther suffered a stroke in 2003, Aretha sent flowers, but no note. 2 years later, on the 1st of July 2005, the news of his death broke and tributes poured in from across the industry. She waited 48 hours before releasing a short, carefully worded statement through her publicist. "I wish him peace." That was all. No anecdotes, no public mourning, just closure in its coldest form. It was not simple bitterness. It was something quieter and more permanent, the refusal to reopen a wound that had never closed. Those close to her said that Luther Vandross was the only man who ever made her doubt her own worth as an artist. He did not leave marks on her skin or steal her bank accounts. He did something else. He reached into the one place she considered sacred, her voice and the space where she created. The studio had once been her sanctuary, the one room where she answered to no one. Under his control, it had become a stage of humiliation, a place where she felt edited, managed, and redefined. That kind of betrayal lingered in a way no broken marriage or public rivalry ever could. Years later, when interviewers brought up the idea of forgiveness, she would sometimes smile faintly and say she believed in it for everyone, eventually. But those who had known her for decades understood the weight of the pause that followed. Some injuries, even for the Queen of Soul, were carved so deep into the music itself that they never truly healed. Luther Vandross had helped deliver one of her sharpest commercial revivals. But in the story, some people believe she carried with her he took something invisible in return. Her sense of safety in her own creative kingdom. And for Aretha Franklin, that was unforgivable. By the spring of 2017, Aretha Franklin was 75 years old. Her body carried the weight of decades on the road, illness, and private battles. Her voice was thinner, sometimes frayed at the edges, but her pride remained untouched, sharp, exact, and completely under her control. She had outlived most of the men who tried to own her, sung for presidents, stood before popes, and watched entire eras of music rise and crumble. No one expected her to start a new war. Yet, on the 25th of April 2017, that is exactly what she did. That morning, the Associated Press received a formal letter from her office in Detroit. 5 pages, typed, stamped, and signed in full. Aretha Louise Franklin. It was not a casual note. It read like a document prepared for a courtroom, not a gossip column. In it, she accused Dionne Warwick, her longtime friend, fellow gospel royalty, and veteran of the same touring circuits, as having lied publicly about her. The tone was cold and precise. No shouting, no slang, just surgical language. By the time the letter made its way into the hands of reporters, headlines were already forming. Aretha Franklin slams Dionne Warwick in shocking statement. To the public, it looked like a sudden explosion. To those who had been close to Aretha, it was the delayed detonation of something that had been smoldering for 5 years. The spark went back to a single day, the 18th of February 2012, at Whitney Houston's funeral. The service was held at New Hope Baptist Church in Newark, New Jersey, the same church where Whitney had sung as a girl. Aretha had been scheduled to perform, a symbolic bridge between gospel generations. But severe leg spasms forced her to cancel at the last moment. Her absence was noticed, whispered about, dissected. In that charged atmosphere, Dionne Warwick stepped to the pulpit. During her remarks, she referred to Aretha as Whitney's godmother and said that Aretha was right here in the church with us in spirit. To many in the pews, it sounded like a gracious acknowledgement, a way of honoring a missing icon. To Aretha, over time, it became something else entirely. She later said that the comment made it seem as if she had faked or exaggerated her illness, as if she had found a reason not to come to the funeral of a woman she admired, and then allowed others to cover for her. In her mind, it turned a legitimate health crisis into a question mark hanging over her loyalty. That feeling of public embarrassment, people close to her claimed, sat quietly in her memory like a splinter. For years, she stayed silent, at least outwardly. No interviews, no statements, no public correction. But silence, for Aretha, was not always forgiveness. In 2017, as she prepared to step back from touring and face the reality of retirement, she revisited the incident. The result was that 5-page letter. In it, she accused Dionne of knowingly inventing the godmother story and misrepresenting her at one of the most watched funerals in recent memory. "Dionne knows exactly what she did," she wrote. "She lied on me." The words were direct, stripped of emotion, yet full of intent. It was not a rant, it was a verdict. The press reacted instantly. 2 women who had once shared stages, prayer circles, and chart positions now appeared on opposite sides of a very public line. They had grown up in the same ecosystem, black gospel, segregated tours, tight-knit church networks, and now they seemed to be tearing at the seams of that world. Reporters reached Dionne Warwick for comment. She responded with a half-laugh and a dismissive line, saying she had no time for nonsense. To the public, it sounded light. To Aretha, according to insiders, it felt like another slap. A second, smaller humiliation stacked on top of the first. Her camp quickly issued a follow-up note, insisting that the matter was not debatable. This was not, in her view, a spat to be patched up in a green room or smoothed over at an awards show. It was about truth, about how she was represented when she was too ill to defend herself. For weeks, entertainment news shows and blogs dissected the feud. Commentators took sides. Some defended Dionne, calling the whole thing a misunderstanding. Others stood with Aretha, pointing to a lifetime of people speaking for her without permission. Many noted how rare it was for Aretha Franklin to name names. Throughout her career, she had survived bad contracts, abusive relationships, shady promoters, and rivalries, and yet she almost never dragged anyone into the light. She preferred silence, distance, and quiet erasure. The fact that she typed out Dionne Warwick's name and sent it attached to her signature told observers that this was not just about one sentence said at a funeral. Those in her inner circle said the real trigger was something older and deeper, the sting she had felt years earlier when her creative authority was questioned during her conflict with Luther Vandross. In both cases, she believed her image had been altered in public without her consent. To Aretha, that wasn't a simple mistake. It was a kind of desecration. A person could betray her in private and still have a path back to her table. But to twist her story, even slightly, in front of the world that was different, that was unforgivable. There was another layer to her anger too, one woven into history. Dionne Warwick came from the same gospel lineage connected to Reverend C.L. Franklin. She had stood in his services, sung in his circles, and moved through the same sacred spaces that had shaped Aretha's childhood. For Aretha, according to people who knew her, the perceived betrayal wasn't just personal. It felt spiritual, almost like an offense against the very church culture that raised them both. The months that followed left no room for reconciliation. Aretha cut off contact, no calls, no private meetings. When asked about Dionne during her final stretch of concerts in 2017, she answered with chilling precision. She wished her well in her own way. The phrasing was deliberate, polite on the surface, but edged with iron. Behind closed doors, the emotional cost showed. Assistants recalled seeing her pace the halls of her Detroit mansion late at night, the city lights glowing through tall windows as she murmured lines from that letter to herself. She would adjust a phrase, repeat a sentence, then fall silent, as if still editing the confrontation long after the paper had left her desk. It was not revenge she was chasing. It was clarity, the restoration of her name. For a woman who had built a career singing about respect, reputation was not just vanity, it was sacred ground. She once told a confidant that gossip had destroyed more gospel voices than sin ever did. To her, sin was between a person and God. Disrespect, however, was between that person and her. And she treated those as two very different courts of judgment. That summer, as she worked on what would be her final studio recordings, the question resurfaced during an interview. A journalist asked if she regretted writing the letter to Dionne. Aretha responded that she regretted nothing that defended the truth. That sentence made its way onto front pages and trending lists, quoted as proof that even at the edge of her career, she would not bend when it came to her own story. The feud never healed. There was no quiet meeting, no photograph of two legends embracing backstage, no final, soft-spoken truce. When Aretha Franklin died the following year, Dionne Warwick attended the funeral and sat quietly in the third row while Aretha's own recordings poured through the cathedral, rolling over the crowd like a wave. The air in that sanctuary, some attendees later said, felt heavy with everything left unsaid. Aretha did not speak from that stage. Her voice came only through the speakers in songs recorded long ago, but in a way that fit her perfectly. Even in death, she had arranged things so that she held the last word. The letter that stunned America was more than a celebrity spat. It was the final eruption of a lifetime of carefully contained fire. The last time she would drag a private wound into the open and refuse to let someone else write the script. Age had weakened her body, but it had not cooled her resolve. As with every man and woman who crossed her boundary, Aretha did not offer easy forgiveness. She simply outlasted them. After decades of private wars, Aretha Franklin appeared to find a strange kind of peace in the early 1980s. Columbia Records had stumbled with her. The chart positions dipped. The critics whispered that the Queen of Soul had quietly been pushed from her own throne. Then a new figure entered the frame. Clive Davis, the architect behind Arista Records, a man known for resurrecting careers that the industry had already written off. He offered her something she had not felt in a long time: rebirth. And for a while, he delivered exactly that. Under his guidance, Aretha recorded Who's Zoomin' Who in 1985. The album sold in the millions and introduced her to a younger audience that had grown up on MTV, not on Sunday morning choirs. To the world, their partnership looked like a masterclass in trust, the visionary executive and the unshakable legend. Together, they seemed to have cracked the code that other labels could not. But beneath the platinum plaques, another, quieter tension began to build, one made of contracts, image, and control. Clive Davis was, before anything else, a businessman. He believed in market trends, radio formats, and strategic collaborations. Aretha believed in faith, spontaneity, and the invisible electricity of a live band locked into the same groove. Their creative chemistry was powerful but fragile. In August 1985, when Who's Zoomin' Who topped the charts, Clive hosted a private celebration at his Manhattan apartment. Photographers captured the moment, Clive holding a platinum plaque beaming, while Aretha stood at his side in furs and diamonds, smiling but slightly distant. Later, in an interview with Jet magazine, she said, "They wanted to polish me into something I wasn't." To her, the success felt less like a homecoming and more like a transaction. To him, it was simply strategy. By 1987, Clive began pushing her toward pop duets and crossovers. George Michael, Annie Lennox. There was even talk, according to some reports, of a possible collaboration with Michael Jackson. Aretha resisted. She feared that chasing too much crossover appeal would scrub away the gospel-soaked core that made her who she was. That same year, when she won a Grammy for Freeway of Love, she walked to the microphone and thanked her family, her faith, and her fans. Clive Davis's name did not leave her lips. Insiders noticed the omission and read it as a message. Then came the blow she could not ignore. In 1990, during a private Arista board meeting, Clive approved a marketing campaign branding Aretha Franklin as America's Lady of Soul. On the surface, the slogan sounded respectful, but for the woman who had fought decades to be called the Queen of Soul, it felt like a demotion, a soft downgrade written in 10-foot letters. The campaign rolled out on billboards and TV spots without her direct consent. On the 3rd of March 1990, driving through Los Angeles, she saw one of those billboards for the first time, her image, her voice, reduced to a tagline she had not chosen. According to people close to her, she called her team in fury. Within weeks, the ads disappeared, but the bruise remained. The distance between them widened as Arista's roster expanded. Clive signed younger talents like Whitney Houston and Toni Braxton, artists he began to position at the center of the label's universe. Aretha watched as the spotlight that had once been fixed on her drifted elsewhere. At the 1,994 Grammys, she sat in the audience while Clive took the stage to present an award to Whitney. Cameras caught a shot of Aretha's face, neutral, almost unreadable. Tabloids printed the frame under captions like, "The Queen left waiting," turning a single expression into a symbol of shifting power. In public, the relationship never erupted into open warfare. It hardened into ritual politeness instead. Invitations were exchanged. Hugs were staged for cameras, but the warmth was thin. When Arista celebrated its 25th anniversary in 2000, Aretha appeared, performed one song, accepted the applause, and left before Clive delivered his closing speech. Her driver later claimed she rode back to the hotel in silence, looking out the window, not saying a word. In interviews, she remained diplomatic. "Mr. Davis did a great deal for me," she said once, "and I wish him continued success." The surface words were gracious. Those who knew her heard something else behind them, a boundary. Gratitude for her was simple. Trust was not. She believed that her soul, the intangible force in her music, had been packaged, marketed, and sold as a product. She was never sure where the line between partnership and exploitation truly lay. Years later, when Clive Davis released his autobiography, The Soundtrack of My Life, in 2013, Aretha reportedly read the chapter about her and grew increasingly angry. In the book, he described her as temperamental and overly cautious, someone he had to coax into greatness. She saw that phrasing as a familiar theft, the old story of a man stepping forward to claim authorship over a woman's triumph. She did not confront him publicly, but, according to friends, she never forgot how those sentences made her feel. By the time of her unforgettable performance at the Kennedy Center Honors in 2015, when she sat at the piano and sang "You Make Me Feel Like a Natural Woman" for Barack and Michelle Obama, Clive Davis was in the audience, applauding with everyone else. Aretha's coat slid from her shoulders, her voice rose and cracked the room open, and the crowd rose to its feet. When the last note faded, she glanced out over the sea of faces. If her gaze crossed his, she did not linger. In public, they remained linked by history and business. In private, people close to her said she had come to accept one hard truth. In her world, every savior eventually became another kind of control. Clive Davis had given her a second act, a glittering rebirth. But he had also reminded her that even a queen can be marketed like a commodity. What she felt for him was not the raw hatred she reserved for others. It was something colder, a steady ache of disillusionment, a quieter kind of betrayal that left no scandalous headlines, only a scar she carried into the final years of her life. When Aretha Franklin died on the 16th of August 2018, in her Detroit home, the world did what it always does for its legends. It watched, it filmed, it wept. Thousands poured into Greater Grace Temple to say goodbye. Her golden casket glowed under crystal chandeliers, surrounded by towering arrangements of roses and choirs, singing the same hymns she had once led as a little girl. On television, it looked like a nation grieving in unison, but those closest to her understood something else. Her death was not a clean ending. It was the sealing of a vault, a life's worth of secrets, grudges, and unfinished sentences locked away forever. In the weeks after her passing, people inside her inner circle quietly repeated the same idea. Aretha had taken her grudges to the grave. Over the years, she had forgiven many kinds of harm, bad contracts, late money, cheap insults in the press. But humiliation, as several friends believed, was the one thing she never released. Ted White, the husband who once tried to rule her with fear. Luther Vandross, the producer who cut into her pride. Dionne Warwick, the friend whose words at a funeral turned into a public wound. None of their names appeared in the handwritten wills discovered in 2020, tucked beneath sofa cushions and inside notebooks in her Bloomfield Hills home. 3 different documents, each crowded with careful instructions about her estate, her jewelry, her sons, even her furniture, but not a single mention of the people who had once stood beside her in the spotlight. Even in death, she was editing the cast list of her own story. One former bandmate reportedly said she carried her grievances like other people carried prayer books. Every slight, every cutting remark, every act of disrespect remembered, catalogued, and never truly forgiven. She could pray for someone's soul on Sunday morning, hand a meal to a stranger on a cold night, and still freeze out a friend who crossed a line once. A colleague told Rolling Stone that Aretha could forgive sin, but not disrespect sin she felt was between you and God. Disrespect was strictly between you and her. In her mind, those two things lived in different courts, under different laws. That belief shaped both her power and her isolation. In her final years, trust became a scarce currency. Her calls grew shorter. Her circle shrank. She left her mansion only when duty or performance demanded it. Assistants said that even as her health failed, she refused to let anyone else choose her wardrobe, rearrange her schedule, or finalize her set list. Control, by then, was more than a habit. It was the last comfort left in a life where so much control had been taken from her early on. After the funeral, a recording surfaced from her last rehearsal at Detroit's Music Hall in late 2017. The audio captured a voice that sounded fragile in places, but still relentless in its reach. She stopped in the middle of songs, rewound phrases, and repeated a single line again and again until it landed exactly where she wanted it. Those who listened said it felt like more than simple preparation. It sounded like a final struggle for mastery, one last attempt to make the music obey her completely. Today, her legacy rests not only on her genius, but on her refusal to bend. She was revered and feared in almost equal measure. Politicians chased her endorsements. Musicians treated her like a living shrine. Yet inside that reverence was always a quiet warning. To cross Aretha was to risk being erased from her kingdom. To love her, truly, was to accept that she would always rule alone, on her own terms. She sang about forgiveness and mercy, but in daily life she practiced something far more selective. In 2020, when one of her unfiled wills was read aloud in a Michigan courtroom, a single line stood out above the estate details. She had written, Everything I am is the result of everything I survived. It did not read like bitterness, it read like a verdict. For Aretha Franklin, pain was not just something to endure, it was raw material. Every betrayal was folded into another verse. Every long silence became a note held just a second longer. Letting go, to her, often looked too much like surrender, and surrender was a language the Queen of Soul never fully learned. Some say hatred eats away at the spirit. For Aretha, it may have worked differently. It became armor, the only shield strong enough to stand between her and an industry and a world that had spent decades trying to claim pieces of her voice. She sang about respect because she had spent her life clawing for it, demanding it, and bleeding for it. Every melody held a memory, every lyric covered a scar. The man she was believed to truly hate, and all those who wounded her along the way, became symbols of a battle that reached beyond rhythm and blues, the fight for a woman's right to remain unbroken, unowned. She did not hand out forgiveness easily because, in her eyes, forgiveness often meant handing back power. And if power was the last thing she still controlled, she held onto it until her final breath. Aretha Franklin's story, in the end, is not simply one of anger. It is a story of survival. She turned fury into architecture, silence into legacy, and pain into the soundtrack of a generation. Do you think Aretha was right to grip that anger so tightly? Or did it steal her peace in the end? If you want more untold stories buried behind the legends of soul, don't forget to subscribe.